The HOA president called 911 screaming about my filthy horses polluting the water, and demanded their immediate removal. So I showed her my Border Patrol badge. Those were federal law enforcement horses conducting mandatory training. She got a federal investigation and I got continued community support for national security operation. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. She called 911 screaming about dangerous horses polluting the water when I let my animals swim in my own ranch pond. 30 minutes later, she was explaining to Border Patrol agents why she'd interfered with federal law enforcement horse training. The screaming started at 6:15 a.m. while I was watching my horses enjoy their morning swim in the pond. I'd been doing this routine for 3 years, letting thunder, storm, and lightning cool off in the water after their training runs. It was peaceful until Sandra Whitmore's voice cut through the morning air like a chainsaw. "What are you doing? Get those filthy animals out of the water right now." I looked up to see a woman in a perfectly pressed jogging outfit standing on the hill above my property, pointing at my horses like they were committing crimes against humanity. "Morning, ma'am," I called back. "Just letting my horses cool down." "Those disgusting beasts are contaminating our community water supply," she shrieked, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police, the health department, and animal control. This is a public health emergency." I walked closer to the fence line, genuinely confused. "Ma'am, this is my pond on my property. It's not connected to any public water system." "I don't care whose property it is," she snapped, already dialing. "Allowing livestock to swim in water that could affect our property values is illegal, unsanitary, and probably criminal. I'm Sandra Whitmore, president of Rolling Hills Estates HOA, and I will not tolerate this environmental disaster in our community." That's when I realized Sandra Whitmore had no idea what she was walking into. "Ma'am, these aren't just livestock. These are working horses. I don't care if they're Olympic champions. Get them out of that water before I have you arrested for environmental violations." I watched her finish her 911 call with growing amusement. "911, I need police, animal control, and environmental enforcement at Rolling Hills Ranch immediately. Someone is allowing horses to contaminate water sources and creating public health hazards." After she hung up, I pulled out my own phone and made a call that would change everything. "Border Patrol Station Alpha, this is Agent Rodriguez. How can I help you?" "Agent Rodriguez, this is Agent Garcia. I need to report civilian interference with federal horse training operations at my location." Sandra's confident expression flickered as she heard federal and agent. "What kind of interference, Agent Garcia?" "A civilian is threatening to have my patrol horses removed from their training facility and claiming federal law enforcement operations are environmental violations." "Stand by, Agent Garcia. We're dispatching supervisors to your location immediately." I hung up and smiled at Sandra, who was staring at me with growing concern. "Agent Garcia?" she repeated weakly. "That's right. Border Patrol Agent Miguel Garcia. And those filthy animals you want removed? They're federal law enforcement horses conducting mandatory water training exercises." The color drained from Sandra's face. "Border Patrol horses? Thunder, storm, and lightning are trained for river crossings, water rescues, and patrol operations along waterways. This pond is their designated training facility, approved by federal authorities for law enforcement purposes. But they're contaminating the water. They're conducting federally mandated training that could save lives. And you just called 911 to shut down federal law enforcement operations." That's when the first police car arrived, followed quickly by an animal control truck and a county environmental inspector. Sandra rushed over to them like she was greeting a rescue team. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is letting horses pollute water sources and claims he's some kind of federal agent." Deputy Martinez stepped out of the patrol car and immediately recognized me. "Agent Garcia, what's the situation?" "Good morning, Deputy. This woman called 911 to report my Border Patrol horses conducting water training exercises. She's demanding removal of federal law enforcement animals from their authorized training facility." Deputy Martinez looked from me to Sandra to the horses peacefully swimming in the pond. "Ma'am, did you call 911 to report Border Patrol horse training?" "I called to report environmental contamination," Sandra insisted. "I don't care what agency he claims to work for. Horses in water is unsanitary and illegal. Ma'am, federal law enforcement training isn't subject to local environmental regulations." "That's impossible. HOA rules clearly state." "HOA rules don't supersede federal law enforcement operations," I interrupted, pulling out my credentials and federal training authorization. Deputy Martinez examined my identification and the training documents. Agent Garcia, are these horses conducting official Border Patrol training? Absolutely. Water crossing training is mandatory for mounted patrol units. These exercises are conducted under federal authority and approved by my sector commander. The animal control officer who'd been listening to the conversation shook his head. Ma'am, if these are federal law enforcement animals, we have no authority to remove them. Sandra's voice was getting more desperate. Someone has to stop this. Our property values will be destroyed if people think there's livestock contamination in our area. These aren't livestock, I explained patiently. They're federal law enforcement officers. Four-legged officers, but officers nonetheless. That's when the Border Patrol supervisors arrived. 2 vehicles with federal plates and agents in full tactical gear. Agent Rodriguez stepped out of the lead vehicle and surveyed the scene. Agent Garcia, report. Sir, this civilian called 911 claiming our horse training operations are environmental violations. She's demanding removal of federal animals from authorized training facilities. Agent Rodriguez turned to Sandra with the kind of stare that made civilian troublemakers reconsider their life choices. Ma'am, are you interfering with Border Patrol training operations? I'm protecting our community from unsanitary conditions, Sandra replied, but her voice was shaking now. These horses are federal law enforcement assets conducting mandatory training. Do you understand you're interfering with federal operations? I don't care what kind of operations they are. HOA regulations prohibit livestock in community water sources. Agent Rodriguez pulled out his radio. Sector Command, this is Rodriguez. We have civilian interference with horse training at Agent Garcia's facility. Request clarification on federal authority. The radio crackled back immediately. Agent Rodriguez, all horse training operations are federally authorized. Any interference should be documented and reported to federal prosecutors. Sandra was starting to understand the magnitude of her mistake. Federal prosecutors? Ma'am, interfering with federal law enforcement operations is a federal crime, Agent Rodriguez explained. These horses are conducting training that protects our border and saves lives. But they're just swimming in a pond. They're training for river crossings where we rescue people from drowning, chase smugglers through waterways, and patrol areas regular vehicles can't reach. This training is critical to national security. Deputy Martinez stepped forward. Ma'am, I think you should apologize to Agent Garcia and allow the federal training to continue. But Sandra Whitmore wasn't ready to surrender. I'm calling my lawyer, the county commissioner, and the state environmental agency. Someone will shut down this operation. That's when I decided Sandra needed a lesson in federal authority that she'd never forget. Sandra, since you're so concerned about regulations, let me explain something. This ranch is designated as a federal law enforcement training facility. My horses aren't just swimming, they're conducting counter-smuggling operations training. What does that mean? It means this entire property operates under federal jurisdiction during training hours. Your HOA has zero authority over federal law enforcement facilities. Agent Rodriguez nodded. That's correct. This property is classified as a federal training installation when operations are active. Sandra looked around desperately. You can't just declare private property federal jurisdiction. I didn't declare anything, I replied, pulling out another document. The Department of Homeland Security classified this facility 3 years ago when I was assigned to mounted patrol operations. Agent Rodriguez examined the classification document. Agent Garcia, show Ms. Whitmore Section 12A. I pointed to the relevant paragraph. During active training operations, this facility operates under exclusive federal jurisdiction. Local authorities have no enforcement power during federal operations. The implications hit Sandra like a freight train. She'd called 911 to shut down operations at a federal law enforcement facility. This is insane, she whispered. What's insane, Agent Rodriguez said, is calling 911 to report federal agents for doing their jobs. That's when my radio crackled with a message that made Sandra's face go completely white. Agent Garcia, this is Sector Commander Wilson. We've received reports of civilian interference with your training operations. Are federal assets secure? I keyed the radio. Yes, sir. Local civilian called 911 claiming our horse training violates HOA regulations. Situation is under control. Copy that. Document all interference for federal review. Cannot have civilians disrupting border security training. Sandra was staring at the radio like it was a bomb. Border security? Ma'am, Agent Rodriguez explained, These horses are trained to patrol the border, intercept smugglers, and rescue people from dangerous water crossings. The training you tried to shut down directly impacts national security. I just wanted them out of the water. You wanted to shut down federal law enforcement training because it might affect your property values. The county environmental inspector, who'd been quietly listening, stepped forward. Ma'am, I've reviewed the situation. Federal law enforcement training is exempt from local environmental regulations. There's nothing we can do here. Sandra turned to Deputy Martinez desperately. Surely local police have some authority? Not over federal operations, ma'am. I suggest you return to your property and avoid any further interference with Border Patrol training. But Sandra made one final mistake that guaranteed her humiliation. I'm calling Channel 7 News, she declared, pulling out her phone again. The public needs to know about federal agents terrorizing our community with dangerous animals. Agent Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. Sandra had just threatened to report federal law enforcement to the media for doing their jobs. Ma'am, Agent Rodriguez said carefully, are you threatening to use media attention to interfere with federal border security operations? I'm threatening to expose government overreach in our residential community. That's when Agent Rodriguez made the call that ended Sandra's harassment campaign forever. Sector Command, civilian is now threatening media interference with border security training. Request federal investigation into obstruction of law enforcement operations. Copy that, Rodriguez. Opening federal case file on civilian interference. Document everything. Sandra realized too late that threatening media attention against federal agents was the worst possible move. The story that aired on the evening news was not what Sandra had expected. Instead of "Federal Agents Terrorize Community," the headline was "HOA President Tries to Shut Down Border Patrol Horse Training." The coverage made Sandra look like exactly what she was, an entitled woman who tried to interfere with federal law enforcement because horses in water offended her sensibilities. The video of her arguing with Border Patrol agents while horses swam peacefully in the background went viral within hours. #HOAVS horses became a trending topic as people shared stories of ridiculous HOA overreach. But the real consequences came when the story reached federal attention. Interfering with border security training, even stupidly, triggers automatic federal review. 2 weeks later, Sandra received a letter from the Department of Homeland Security informing her that her actions were under federal investigation for potential obstruction of law enforcement operations. The legal fees alone cost her $15,000 before federal prosecutors decided she was too stupid to be a real threat to national security. But the damage to her standing in Rolling Hills estates was permanent. Residents who'd elected her to protect their interests discovered she'd nearly brought federal investigation down on their entire community. The emergency HOA meeting was brutal. Sandra tried to explain her actions, but residents weren't interested in hearing why their president had harassed federal agents. "You called 911 on Border Patrol horses?" one man asked incredulously. "I was protecting our water quality," Sandra insisted weakly. "From federal law enforcement training?" another resident shouted. "Are you insane?" The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Sandra was removed as HOA president and banned from holding any future board positions. Her house went on the market within a month. Potential buyers avoided the property once they learned about the federal investigation and viral media coverage. 6 months later, I was watching thunder, storm, and lightning enjoy their morning swim when the new HOA president stopped by. "Agent Garcia," she called respectfully from the fence line, "the board wanted to personally thank you for your service and assure you that your training operations have our full support." "Thank you. That's much more welcoming than last year's reception." Sandra's behavior was embarrassing for our entire community. "We've learned to respect federal law enforcement operations." What happened to her? She moved to Arizona. Apparently, she's having trouble finding HOA positions after the national news coverage and federal investigation. That evening, as I was feeding the horses after their training, Agent Rodriguez stopped by for his weekly check-in. "Garcia, any more civilian interference with operations?" "None, sir. The new HOA president actually thanked me for protecting the border." "Good." Federal prosecutors closed Sandra's case, but it's on file if she ever interferes with federal operations again. What was the final determination? Stupidity isn't a federal crime, but interfering with border security training comes close. She got a warning that any future interference would result in federal charges. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the pond gold and orange, I watched my 3 partners cooling off after another successful training day. Thunder, storm, and lightning were more than horses. they were federal law enforcement officers who'd saved lives and protected our borders. Sandra Whitmore had tried to shut down their training because horses in water offended her property value sensibilities. Instead, she'd learned that federal law enforcement doesn't care about HOA regulations, and Border Patrol agents don't appreciate civilian interference with national security operations. The horses were swimming peacefully, exactly as they had before Sandra's intervention, but now with the knowledge that their training was protected by federal authority and supported by a community that understood the difference between livestock and law enforcement. My radio crackled with the evening report to Sector Command: horse training operations completed successfully. No civilian interference. Recommend continuation of water crossing exercises. Copy that, Garcia. Keep up the good work. Sometimes the best defense against harassment is simply being federal law enforcement with horses that are tougher than the people trying to stop them. Sandra learned that lesson the hard way, in front of Border Patrol supervisors and a national television audience. The training continues every morning, now with community support and federal backing. The horses get better at water crossings every day, and nobody has tried to shut us down since Sandra discovered that Border Patrol agents take their jobs seriously. Federal authority, it's not just for humans, it's for horses who protect America's borders, one swimming lesson at a time.